Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of Princess State of Mind, where we talk about fiction, fairy tales, and the fairer sex. I'm Faith Moore, and I am really excited to have as my guest today Spencer Klavan. So obviously, Spencer is my brother, and that is my favorite of his titles. But he is also a lecturer in ancient Greek at Oxford and a biblical scholar, and he is here today to talk to us about Cinderella and Jesus Christ. So hi, Spencer. Are you there? Okay, yeah, we're having some internet difficulties, and I actually can't hear Spencer at the moment. Let's see. Are you there? Okay. Oh, I've got you. I've got you now. Hi.
Hi. Okay. Yes, we're having some internet problems, but let's see if this works. If not, I can try something else.
Great. Well, welcome to the show for now, anyway.
Great to be here.
Okay. So before we talk about Cinderella and Jesus, let's just prove that you are not here just because you are my little brother, but also that you really do know what you're talking about. You are not only a scholar of ancient Greek and classics, but also have something going on right now on your website called the Isaiah Project. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely, yes. I think that being your brother should qualify me to speak on any subject.
Yeah, absolutely.
Scholarly merit. However, so in my sort of double life, in my other life, I am a PhD. I'm a PhD student in classics, and on the side of that, I've started to learn biblical Hebrew. About 4 years ago, I started working on biblical Hebrew, and since then have initiated this many-year-long translation of the book of Isaiah from the Bible. And so what I'm doing right now on my website, I've completed this translation. It's a artistic modern English translation of this classic Hebrew prophecy. On my website, www.rejoice-evermore.com.
Which is actually in the description of this video. So
look at that. Okay. Fantastic. So yeah, if you go to the description of the video, you can find a link to my website where every week I release a new chapter of the translation accompanied with some devotional reflections / scholarly explanation, because the book, one of the things about the book of Isaiah is it's very famous and exciting, but oftentimes nobody knows what the heck is going on because there's a lot of very involved description of ancient Middle Eastern history. And that is what I'm doing at the moment and why I know a little bit about the Bible.
Yes, or a lot bit. And in fact, I have read all of these things, which are very illuminating, especially for someone like me who is not a biblical scholar and often does not, as you say, does not know what is going on. Yeah, you definitely, viewers, you should definitely go and check that out. It's really great. And I will just say, yeah, it's a translation. So that means that it's coming from Hebrew, right? Ancient Hebrew?
Correct. Yeah. It's
you really do know what you're talking about.
Yeah. I guess perhaps more than your average bear.
Exactly.
Yes.
Excellent. So now we have proven that you deserve to be here to discuss this with us. So this is the thing. And so obviously my new book, Saving Cinderella, What Feminists Get Wrong About Disney Princesses and How to Set It Right, is out now. The link to that is also in the description of this video. I hope that you all will buy it and tell me what you think. But one of the things that happened is when I went to write the book, I watched all of the movies, obviously, again, that I was going to be writing about. And the very first thing that happened to me when I started rewatching Cinderella was that I became incredibly convinced that Walt Disney was trying to make, if not a totally direct parallel, a nod toward the Christ narrative with the Cinderella story. And I thought either this, and so then I Googled it and nobody had written about this. So I was like, either I'm completely insane and this is some sort of sacrilege, or I'm onto something here. So of course I called up my brother because he's the smartest person I know. And also he knows a lot about the Bible. And so we sort of talked this through. So what we ended up kind of discussing is in the book, Saving Cinderella, so you should read it. But we're going to talk a little bit about that here now, although everything that we talk about here is not in the book, and everything in the book we're not going to talk about here. Ha ha ha. Watch this. Read the book. Both. So let's just sort of take us through this. The first thing I want to say is that Disney was in fact a Christian. He wrote about that and talked about that, and he talked about the importance of Christianity in his life and in his work. So it's not completely insane to even start thinking about this. So let's just go through this a little bit, and we'll see where we get in the end. One of the very first things that happens in the movie is there's this little song, and the lyrics of the song are, "Though you're dressed in rags, you wear an air of queenly grace. Anyone can see a throne would be your proper place." So obviously, first and foremost, this is about how Cinderella is sort of always internally a fairy tale princess, and that even when she's in rags, she deserves to be the feminine ideal of princesshood, etc. But here's my question. Does it seem totally far-fetched, Spencer, to sort of draw some parallels between this idea of being in rags but supposed to be on a throne between Cinderella and Jesus?
Right. Okay. So as you say, this was sort of the first thing that you raised with me when we started bouncing back and forth ideas about Jesus in Cinderella. You came to me with a very sort of fleshed out and plausible reading of Disney as a kind, reading of Cinderella as a kind of evangelistic commentary, post-evangelistic text, and that very plausible reading is like fully worked out in the book. But one of your first questions, as you say, was kind of like, is that even a way that you're allowed to look at Disney movies? Is that reading too much into Disney movies? Is that somehow like dragging the Bible down by like imagining that it might emerge in such a humble context as a Disney movie? And so here, once and for all, I think that you and I together can formulate the Spencer Klavan Faith Moore theory of reading way too much into Disney movies so that no one will ever accuse us. Great. So there are I'm going to give you 3 reasons why it is okay to read too much into Disney movies, especially actually only when it comes to Jesus and the gospel and the Bible. The first one, great. And this actually applies to like other things as well. So you don't just have to, use this to justify Disney movies, but really any piece of pop culture. The first one is the one that you described. This is in the book, so I won't talk too much about it, is that Disney was a Christian, right? And so like there might actually be conscious decisions to make explicit references to the Bible in the movie. And readers will have to read the book to find out if they feel like that is true. But option number 2, right, is that this story, the Christ narrative and all of its kind of attendant side narrative, stuff from the Hebrew Bible, is one of the foundation stones, not only of Western ethics and culture, but also of Western literature. I mean, especially the King James Bible, which is an early 17th century translation into English, becomes, maybe alongside the works of Shakespeare, the thing that people like reference when they make art and literature. And we have this, this long history of making poetry and plays and things that basically draw on this as a literary source, even if people don't necessarily believe. Like, you don't actually have to believe in the Bible to use it as a kind of, original reference point. So that could be happening. There could just be like, it could be at like 10 different removes where Disney is referencing something that references something that references the Bible, and like those stories make it in that way. And then option number 3 is one that comes up in the writings of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. If people have read these inklings, these British theologian, scholar, story writers, who basically believe that the Jesus story is like the Uber story that basically fulfills all the other stories that we all were always telling. All the fairy tales and the legends and the myths are kind of like hints or prophecies of this big cosmic moment in history. And if that's the case, then like really all great stories are going to have kind of elements of this story in it, because this story sort of encapsulates the great truth of the human narrative. So all of those things may be going on in Cinderella, and certainly it's not too much to look for those themes. And so then on the particular question of being meant for kingship but being dressed in rags, that really does resonate with one of the sort of central images of Christ's ministry. And the moment that comes most particularly to mind is the moment right before Jesus is about to be crucified. He goes and has dinner with all of his disciples and his friends. It's the famous Last Supper. And in John, which is the kind of most philosophical gospel of the 4 gospel stories, John writes, Jesus knew that the Father had delivered all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was returning from God to God. So he got up from the supper, laid aside his outer garments, and wrapped a towel around his waist. And then Jesus proceeds to wash the feet of his disciples as if he were a kind of slave or servant. And so that is, this classic image of the Son of God, the heir to the kingdom, the literal kingdom of heaven, taking off his clothes, stripping naked, and humbling himself to wash the feet of humanity. So that is like 100% something that calls Christ to mind.
Thank you. Yes, good. So I'm glad I feel very validated and very justified. Yeah, but also, right, like that's kind of what struck me too, is this image of someone who came from something higher, brought down to sort of the lowest of the low, but even as he is the lowest of the low, is still within him or herself the sort of higher being that they were meant to be. So I think that was kind of the first inkling that I had that maybe there was something going on here. And then the next thing is, and this is going to sound a little silly, but I think it really is intentional. There is a cat in the movie named Lucifer, which is obviously like the name, one of the devil's names, right? Or the name for the devil. And so the cat is very devilish, and a lot of stuff happens with the cat that you can read in the book that sort of speaks to the fact that maybe Disney knew what he was doing by naming the cat Lucifer. But can you tell us just a little bit about how Jesus interacts with the devil in the Bible?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. First, let us have a very nerdy and interesting side note about the name Lucifer, and therefore the person of the devil and what his deal is and who he is and where he comes from. So it's famously, or sort of famously, like the devil doesn't actually show up that much certainly in the Old Testament. And a lot of what we now think of as like, this is where the devil comes from, this is what he does, kind of comes from people knowing that there is a figure in the Bible called Satan, who is a tempter and an evildoer, and basically reading him backwards into all of these other stories where tempters and cosmic evildoers come up. And the famous first part where that happens is the serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? Which the Hebrew word for that is nachash, and that's just like a shining, serpenty, slithery snake thing, the most subtle of all the beasts in the field. And then later on in the Hebrew Bible, there's this concept ha-satan, which in Hebrew means something like the accuser, the enemy, the persecutor. And one of the kind of interesting things about the Old Testament in general that people don't always like pay attention to is that a lot of this stuff refers to actual historical people that the ancient Jews were sort of dealing with and fighting against. But also the Jews believed that historical narrative had sort of cosmological or prophetic significance. And so in the Psalms, a lot of times you get ha-satan as like, my military enemy is like crushing me and persecuting me. But then that has a kind of bigger spiritual significance, that like there is a spiritual enemy that's trying to beat me down and trying to tear me away from God or cause me to despair. And that is where you start to say, okay, this accuser, this person that is against me, is the same figure that tricked humanity at the very beginning. And then there's also, in the book of Job, which is a sort of story about this guy that gets persecuted for seemingly no reason. Satan is very present in that and comes to God and basically asks for permission to like torture this guy. And so slowly you start to build up these different narratives, some of which do have Satan in them and some of which we sort of assume Satan is in, where we start to construct this character of like the great enemy of all mankind. Then in Isaiah, this is the funny thing. So the word Lucifer describes an ancient Greco-Roman myth about the light bringer, which is what Lucifer means. The Venus, which is the planet that we can see in the sky, kind of ascends all the way up to heaven and then goes back down over the course of the night and down below. And so that leads to all these myths about like lower gods rebelling against the higher Greek gods and then getting smacked down and have been crushed for their rebellion. And in Isaiah is talking about the king of Babylon. There's this whole drama between Babylon and Israel. And he's saying like, you, king of Babylon, you're like the star that goes up, that rises super high right now, but you're actually going to get cast back down. And centuries later, people are sort of like, oh, maybe he's talking about this myth that like there's a rebellious god that sort of flies up and gets cast back down. And that is why Lucifer becomes this rebellious angel who becomes Satan. And so like all of these things get kind of like rolled up into one, the rebellious angel and the tempter and the evil adversary. And then finally, we move on then to the New Testament, where like Jesus is coming up against Satan, which is the word that gets used, the name that gets used for this like evil adversary creature who tempts Jesus in the wilderness. There's a very famous passage that like Jesus goes out to sort of like have his spiritual formation. And there's this figure that comes up and says like, come, and if you're so hungry, Jesus is fasting, says, if you're so hungry and you're the Son of God, just like turn stones into bread. And Jesus responds by quoting a passage from Deuteronomy, right? You shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And basically this Satan is this figure that in the New Testament is supposed to have like tempted and destroyed humanity through all of history. And Jesus is kind of here essentially to vanquish him. That's one of the first points that people think Jesus is prophesied in the Bible, is way back in Genesis, when that snake tempts Eve to take the apple and the fall happens. God says, now there will be enmity. You will be enemies between your son, the Son of Man, and the son of the serpent, and the Son of Man will bruise your head and you will bruise his heel. And people kind of think that that refers to this moment when Jesus will like vanquish Satan. And so there's like a big kind of cosmic battle going on all throughout between Satan and this figure, this kind of like figure of all these different myths that comes into one person, Satan, against Jesus in the Bible.
Right. So now I feel like you are further validating me, because I mean, that's all fascinating. And it's fascinating too that the name of, back to Cinderella, the name of the cat is Lucifer, and that Lucifer, the last thing that happens to Lucifer is that he falls out a window and dies. And so you were talking about Lucifer, the mythological character, kind of rising up to sort of the pinnacle and then falling back down again, and then making that connection between that and Satan, and sort of Satan being vanquished. So like all of that seems to all sort of fit together very nicely. And so then in the movie, Lucifer the cat is vanquished, as I said, by falling out the window, and it happens at the exact moment when Cinderella is able to reveal that she is in fact the person that the prince danced with at the ball, that she's not just this person dressed in rags, that a throne is her proper place. Like those two things go together in the movie. Like the cat falls out the window and dies, and then Cinderella runs out of the room where she's been locked up and reveals, like, it is I, Cinderella, the princess, not just Cinderella, the servant girl. And I deserve to marry the prince because I'm the one. And off she goes to sort of like ascends from being a lowly servant girl to being a highborn maiden, which is actually who she was to begin with. But she gets to marry the prince. And so I'm wondering, is that also in the Bible the moment when the devil is vanquished? Like, does the devil is the devil being vanquished related to Jesus sort of taking his proper place as the Son of God?
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely, it is. This is another one of those things that like is in the Bible, but you have to kind of like dig around to sort of like understand why people have, there's these theological traditions that people believe as part of their Christianity that come out of the Bible, but at like a couple steps removed. So in the Gospels, Satan falling is basically like synonymous with Jesus succeeding and rising. And one place where that happens is Jesus sends out his disciples to go and basically heal and prophesy in his name. And when they come back and they're super stoked because everything's gone so well, Jesus also gets super stoked. And the thing that he says is, I have seen Satan falling from the sky like lightning. And so that's this image again of like the rebellious angel falling and Jesus sort of mounting up and ascending.
Almost like a cat falling out the window.
Almost exactly. Yes. In fact, that's the note many of the ancient critics, write in the margins of the manuscript, like much like a cat as he descends.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Exactly. Meowis. But the other sort of, the great moment when this is supposed to happen is when Christ at last accomplishes his work of saving humanity. And that's again linked to this is called the protevangelium. The protos is the Greek word for first, and evangelium is a announcement of Christ. And so the protevangelion is this moment in Genesis where God prophesies that the Son of Man will bruise the head of the serpent. And so there's two moments where that might happen, and I think it's probably splitting hairs to try to figure out which one it is. But the one option is on the cross when Jesus is finally murdered by the Roman legate Pontius Pilate and the Roman government. When he gives up the ghost, when he dies, he says, "It is finished." And there's this big, crazy moment when there's an earthquake and the sun goes dark, and the veil of the temple, the inner temple of the Jewish people, is torn into this kind of moment when heaven is supposed to be split open to allow human beings to come in and finally be forgiven of their sins. So maybe that's the moment when Satan is finally vanquished. Or you might say that it's going to happen again when Jesus comes back, and this is part of this very trippy thing at the end of the Bible. These visions of Jesus' second coming, called Revelations, which is actually just a translation of the word apocalypse, which means apokalypto, I reveal or I show. And this is the end of the world. And Revelations 12-14, there's this big long story of some of the archangels fighting several beasts, the dragon, and this is where we get things like the number 666 is associated with the beast. And finally, at the end of this big long cosmic battle, the Lamb, which is Jesus, will be victorious over the beast, which will be hurled down into the pit. And so take your pick. But yes, absolutely, that is what happens when Jesus wins. Satan is supposed to fall back down.
Great. So, okay. So still, I feel very validated still. Thank you. I'm so glad you're here. So to sort of further this connection, and to go back to sort of was this intentional on Disney's part? And we're sort of saying, well, I'm saying in my book that I think it was because of, I think he was a Christian, and then the other thing is, so in the first princess movie, which is Snow White, Snow White actually prays to God. She kneels down and she prays, I think, for the dwarves to like her and for Grumpy to like her too or something. But in Cinderella, there isn't actually any praying, but Cinderella does a lot of talking about belief. And one of the first songs that she sings, she says, "No matter how your heart is grieving, if you keep on believing, the dream that you wish will come true." And I sort of interpret this to be, if you have faith, then the thing that you desire, or the outcome that you hope for, will in some way come true. So my question here then is, for Christians, what does that belief actually mean? What are we hoping will come true if we believe?
Great. Okay, so this is what in official theological terms one refers to as a giant can of worms. And so this is an enormous can of worms for 20 different reasons. One central one is that there's a big, long-standing debate in the history of Christianity over what exactly saves you. What is it that is you have to do or say or think or feel that is going to make you get resurrected at the end and have a happy dance in heaven. And that's very flippant, but ultimately we are looking for some consolation for this life that ends in death, that eventually we will emerge into the resurrection and know bliss with God. And the question is kind of how do you get there? And a lot of people since the Reformation, since Martin Luther basically splits off from the Catholic Church, are very insistent that it's sola fide, by faith alone. And they look for that to the letters of Paul mostly, who writes after Jesus' resurrection about the implications of Jesus' death and resurrection. And one of the things that Paul seems to be insisting is that works, which is kind of the alternative to faith or works, that is good deeds and being a really nice person and performing all the right sacrifices and rituals, aren't enough, that human beings can't basically make themselves righteous and holy by doing all the right things, because we just we don't have that ability inside us. And if we try, we end up messing it up or rebelling or getting things wrong. And so we need basically grace. We need God to step in and make up the difference. And so faith is this thing that is supposed to kind of cover that distance between our sort of not really being everything that we wish we were, and not being able to follow moral rules in the same way that we should, and God's forgiving us and coming in the person of Jesus to make up that difference. And so then, right, the question becomes like, what faith in what? What do you believe? What are you hoping for? And the answer might just be that you might have faith that God is going to forgive you, that if you come again and again to ask him for grace and mercy, even no matter how many times you mess up, he's gonna step in, and his blood, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, is going to be enough for you to be saved. There's a whole bunch of other possibilities, right? The Greek word pistis, which is what is translated when we say faith, could have a lot of other translations like belief, confidence, trust. And one thing that people often neglect to mention on the flip side of our faith is that God is faithful, and that's something that is often said in the Bible. So your faith might be a sort of response to the fact that God never leaves you, that even though you might mess up in a way that just feels completely destructive, and you can't possibly see how any good can come, you might still believe that God is able to make things right. And you might come back and repent and say, I'm so sorry that this happened, and now I'm going to try again. Alternatively, there's a kind of what you might call a doxological or a creedal belief, which is propositional. I believe that. And then there's kind of like a list of facts or ideas that you have to believe in. The central one being that Jesus is the Son of God. And this is sort of reiterated several times in the Bible, like if you have faith in God and in Jesus Christ whom he has sent. So this belief, this confession, which Peter, one of the first apostles, makes, that like this is the guy that we've been waiting for, who's going to save us, might be the thing that you're supposed to believe in as well. And probably all these things are sort of wrapped up all together, because if you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, then you trust him to take care of you, then you can come to God for mercy, and all of these things get sort of put together into the kind of life that ultimately Christians believe is nourishing and will endure forever, even beyond death. And that's why, as Jesus often says, that your faith has saved you. He pistis sisoken set. Like that's what makes you able to come to God.
Right. And that's really interesting too, because, one of the criticisms of fairy tale princesses and Disney princesses in general is that, they just love, they exist in this hardship and they just love it. Like, doesn't Snow White just love to sweep the floor? And doesn't, Cinderella just, she's just so happy, like scrubbing the floor. But, my argument, and it seems like this is sort of backed up in what you're saying, is that they don't love it. They just believe that doing whatever they're doing should be done with grace and optimism, and that they should find some joy in it, that not like happy yay, but just sort of joy within their task. And so, Cinderella, you mentioned grace, and that quote that I said at the very beginning, an air of queenly grace, like grace is kind of one of these attributes, these princess attributes also, just sort of like these women that are sort of like graceful. And I know that's not the same grace necessarily, but there are these sort of connections going on there. But continuing on in this vein, the other sort of interesting thing that happens in the movie is that Cinderella has a fairy godmother. And obviously a fairy godmother is like a fairy tale trope, and not necessarily to always be connected to God himself. But I think in the movie, the fairy godmother plays a sort of godlike role, even though we shouldn't connect them together, because the fairy godmother's sort of bumbling and silly, and obviously God is not that. But she arrives and she says that she's here to perform a miracle. And I think, she does sort of intervene at this moment. And the moment where she appears is right when Cinderella is at her lowest point. And the thing that Cinderella says to the fairy godmother is, there's nothing left to believe in. But the fairy godmother says, if you'd lost all your faith, I couldn't be here. So what the godmother is saying is, actually, no, you still believe, you just have reached this really low point. And that sort of always makes me think, of, Jesus sort of crying out on the cross. And obviously I'm not saying that these two things are very similar, like somebody who didn't get to go to a party is the same thing as somebody who's dying on the cross to save mankind. Obviously not the same thing at all. But I think operating within the symbolism of Cinderella, it seems like this godlike figure sort of appears at the moment in which, and does this miraculous thing, transforms Cinderella from this lowly being to this superior being at this moment when Cinderella is at her lowest point and saying that she doesn't believe, except the fairy godmother says that she actually does believe. And then you've got Jesus on the cross saying, "Why have you forsaken me?" So what's going on with Jesus there? Like, does he not believe anymore in that moment? Or is it like Cinderella, he does, but he's saying this thing?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of my favorite things that you do in the book, actually, I think throughout, and not just in Cinderella, is that so many of the kind of modern feminist criticisms of Disney princesses arise out of like reading or watching these stories in totally the wrong mode. It's
Right.
like every story has its own kind of language and register, and fairy tales, as you very sort of extensively show, have a particular kind of language of symbolism that you're supposed to be able to read and interpret. And that's also, I think, why it's not that silly to talk about a cat falling from the sky as like Lucifer falling from heaven, or the fairy godmother, who's this sort of goofy, bumbling figure, being something like maybe God the Father coming to rescue the main character, is because that is just the whole story is kind of in that register. It's all in the kind of goofy, burlesque, cartoony register. And so all of the Gospels are not in that register. They're in a different magisterial, like cosmic register. But if you just take that register and like translate it into fairy tale language, then it's totally valid to say, well, in that world, in that little sphere, this is, the sort of God figure. The question about Jesus on the cross is another giant can of worms. I mean, that moment is both, I think, one of the most profound and powerful moments in the gospel, and also one of the most mysterious. I mean, Christians, since it happened, have been kind of marking it in the liturgy, in their worship. And it's kind of one of these things that you come to contemplate rather than to analyze theologically, which for an egghead like me is sometimes a little bit uncomfortable. You want to know exactly what's going on. And in particular, you want to know, is that an actual loss of faith on the part of the Son of God? And what would that mean? I mean, my instinct, my inclination is that it is most profound and deep if what we're saying is actually that God has somehow taken onto himself even our moments of doubt and unbelief. Because what's the greatest pain that a human being can know? It's not only to have physical suffering or to lose somebody or to be, in grief over some terrible pain. It's also not to know why. I mean, that's kind of like the deepest agony, is to both experience suffering and feel as if there's no logic or reason behind it. And one of the great benefits of the Trinity is that God can both sort of enter fully into that human experience of not understanding his pain. And that way he knows what it's like to be us. He can come alongside us and suffer in that way. But also at the same time, in God the Father, who's kind of eternal and outside of time, God doesn't have to therefore like completely disappear or stop existing, right? And so my guess, and this is only a guess, is that Jesus, the man, the divine man, Jesus, does actually lose faith in that moment. There's every possibility that I'm wrong, and one way that I might be wrong is that Jesus is also quoting a psalm there. That moment, "Lama sabachthani," why have you forsaken me, is a quote from Psalm 22. And so and that psalm does sort of have a trajectory away, out of despair and into more hope. And so it might be the case that he's feeling a great deal of despair and expressing himself. But if you really like sat down and questioned him, he would say, like, yeah, somewhere in my heart, I still believe. And ultimately, we just, we don't actually. So there's some parts of the Trinity that we don't have access to, and some of that is between Jesus and God, and it's just for us to kind of be like, whoa, and that's where we are with that one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting, and I think, that kind of ambiguity, I think, is also there in the movie that we're talking about, in the Cinderella moment, because I think, Cinderella is expressing that she doesn't believe anymore. Like this way of being that she kind of has set up for herself in the beginning of the story of just keep believing and everything will be okay. Work hard, do the best that you can. She feels like she did all of that and it's just not working out for her. But the godmother says, no, deep inside of you, you still think it, because otherwise I couldn't show up. I can't appear to people who just don't even believe in anything at all. And so I think that's part of it. And so for me, all of this, like to me, and obviously we can't know why Disney put all this stuff in the movie, or even if it was intentional. I really think it was. And I think if you go back and watch the movie with this in mind, it's kind of hard not to see it. But for me, the reason it's all there, and we don't know, and he didn't write or talk about this as far as we know, the reason it's all there is because I think he's saying something about why this princess narrative, these princess stories and fairy tales, why they're so important. And I think it really speaks to, obviously he didn't know that feminists were going to come along 70 years later and start complaining about these movies and these characters, but it really speaks to this because, their complaint is, oh, these princesses, they wait around for a guy and they just, they fall in love at first sight, and what's the deal with that? But I actually think that this movie is Disney telling us why true love, romantic true love, is so important, and why it's not just kind of like a story about a guy and a girl. So, and this is kind of the last point that I want to raise here, is that there is a very clear connection between the love that Cinderella and the prince feel for one another in the movie and some kind of divine situation, some kind of heavenly situation. The song that they sing is, so this is love, this is what makes life divine. The key to all heaven is mine. And I know that those are sort of ways of describing like great things, but this is also the product of the miracle that the fairy godmother made. And it's also the miracle that Cinderella has been dreaming of. So in the beginning, she's talking about how she's dreaming and believing, and this is the miracle that she's been dreaming of, that she fell in love with the prince. So my question is there any biblical precedent for making a connection between romantic love and some sort of divine love, or some kind of connection with the divine?
Okay, yes, there's definitely a biblical precedent for this. It all gets very mystical, and sometimes like the kinds of comparisons that we think we draw are like, again, at several removes from like what the Bible does. The classic comparison between romantic love and heavenly love is this idea that the church, the Christian church, is the bride of Christ, and that ultimately when the last trumpet blows and everyone is resurrected, there's going to be a wedding between this huge, international and transgenerational church and Jesus. And there's a point in the letter to the Ephesians that kind of makes this comparison: husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing water through the word, and so on. And there's a kind of comparison between the way that human husbands and wives are supposed to interact and the way that Jesus and the church interacts. And from that, Christians have gotten this idea of marriage as a sacrament. And sacraments are supposed to be kind of like outward signs of invisible spiritual truths. And so there, the idea is that like when a man and a woman make a commitment to one another for life, they're basically acting out in miniature the way that Christ has committed to all of humanity for all of eternity. And so that is basically a way for us to like understand our romantic love as some, an imperfect picture of the passion and the excitement with which Jesus pursues all of us. And so it's very easy to slip, when you get into this, to slip into like Jesus as my cosmic boyfriend, which is kind of like not what's going on. But what is going on is that like we in our own little human spheres experience this incredibly powerful transcendent emotion, which we then channel into a lifelong commitment. And that act is supposed to not only be a very beautiful thing that people do between one another, but a kind of public display that shows to the world, like, this is what it looks like when God commits to humanity.
Right, exactly. And I actually think that is exactly what Walt Disney is trying to say in the movie, that
Okay.
that these two people, the princess and the prince, who in a fairy tale represent the sort of ideal of humankind, like the ideal of man and the ideal of woman, recognize within each other some fundamental thing about each other's souls, and connect. And in fairy tale, I call it fairy tale shorthand, right? The outer trappings of the dress are kind of the way in which Cinderella, her inner self, has become made manifest, and the prince is then able to see that, and they recognize that within each other, that they're people of worth, and that this is a really important connection that they're making, and that they should then sort of stick together and live out their lives, and that is a really fundamental and important part of human life. And I think that is what Disney was trying to say, and it's sort of like this blueprint, I think, for why, for how to be a person and a princess, and how to move forward, and also this blueprint for sort of the fairy tales moving forward, and that it's so sad that the movies have kind of deviated from. But we are now out of time. I hope that now we have proven everything to everyone about everything, and I also hope that people will go out and read this book and know that you helped with it. But also, I hope they will go and visit you. First, in the description of this video is the link to your website, with the Isaiah Project. But also, I also put your Twitter handle in there. But how can people sort of reach you if they want to get in touch with you?
Yeah, I think Twitter is probably the best way to find me. If you go on that website, which is linked down below, you can sign up also for email updates, and there's just boxes all over the website. And basically, any page you go to, you can just type in your email address and hit subscribe, and then you'll get email updates from the Isaiah Project, and you can see what's been done already. But the most important thing that everybody should do is buy Saving Cinderella, because it's exciting and has so much in there that we didn't talk about, not only about Cinderella, but about so many other things.
Yes, well, thank you. Do everything. Go to the website, buy the book, do the thing, do all the things. Well, thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure, as always, to talk to you, and I will also talk to you in real life. Not that this is not real life, but later. And for those of you watching, please make sure that you subscribe to this channel, and also hit the little bell so that you know what's going on and you get the notifications. And then please do buy the book, Saving Cinderella: What Feminists Get Wrong About Disney Princesses and How to Set It Right. It's available on Amazon. There's also a link to that in the description of this video. And if you get it and you read it and you like it, please post a review on Amazon. All right. I think that the next episode of this is after Christmas, so I hope everyone has a very Merry Christmas. And I will be thinking of all of you, and we'll see you after Christmas. Bye.
Bye.